A new study has come out, a psychological study that sheds some new light on some things in the world that are very interesting in terms of people's mental health, and it comes to some very interesting conclusions. Now, the anthropologists who wrote the study say that they believe that many of the disorders that we face in the world today, depression, anxiety, PTSD, might not actually be medical at all, but they might be a part of a defense mechanism that evolutionarily came into people. And they make a very bold claim. Now, I know the way that this sounds, but let me give you what it is that they say is their evidence for this. Okay, first of all, they say medical science has never been able to prove anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder are inherited conditions. That may or may not be true. I'm not entirely certain. Secondly, the study's authors note that despite widespread and increasing use of antidepressants, rates of anxiety and depression do not seem to be improving. From 1990 to 2010, the global prevalence of major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders held at 4.4 and 4%. At the same time, evidence has continued to show that antidepressants perform no better than a placebo. Now, I actually take issue with a part of this. The global rates of depression, anxiety, in other words, other social anxiety disorders, that may be true. It actually doesn't sound true to me, but it might very well be true. What I really have a problem with is saying that medication doesn't do anything with these disorders, anything better than a placebo. I'm going to have to go to anecdotal evidence here, and I know how I feel when I don't have medication, and I know how I feel when I do have medication. So to say that medication does nothing, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to completely disagree with this, although I am only giving anecdotal evidence. I'm fairly certain that if you ask anyone else who takes that kind of medication, that they probably feel the same way too. So I'm still really split on this whole study and what it is that it's trying to say. And it says, third, worldwide rates of these disorders remain stable at 1 in 14 people. Yet in conflict-affected areas, an estimate 1 in 5 people suffers from depression, PTSD, anxiety disorders, and other disorders. In other words, you suffer more if you're in a place in conflict. Well, no kidding. The material conditions would certainly facilitate that. Now, it basically is trying to claim that defense systems are adaptations that reliably activate in fitness-threatening situations in order to minimize fitness loss. In other words, like an anxiety attack, ramping up your heart is preparing you to run or preparing you to go into combat, essentially the fight-or-flight mechanism. And that it's an evolutionary thing, that constantly being subjected to a situation where you're going to run or you're going to fight, or a stressful situation which would elicit that kind of response, repeatedly doing so builds that into your brain, and that it's not a disorder per se, but an evolutionary adaptation. The psychic pain of depression helps us focus on adverse events so as to mitigate the current adversity and avoid such future adversities. Except that doesn't work. Okay, if someone who's had depression, that doesn't work. Other people's experiences may be different, but I'm really going to have to call BS on that one. Now, they say that this all sounds very unlikely. It would sound even completely alien to a lot of people, but here's how they wish to actually defend it. They said they've mapped these 3 disorders to branches in the threat detection system of the human brain, and anxiety may be due to a chronic activation of the fight-or-flight system. As I said previously, PTSD may occur when a trauma triggers the freeze response, which helps animals disconnect from pain before they die. And depression might be a chronic activation of that same freeze response. So essentially what they're saying is that it's not a disorder. The brain didn't malfunction. The brain adapted to a situation. Now, the actual study author, Kristen Syme, She's a WSU PhD graduate, compares treating anxiety disorder, depression, PTSD with antidepressants to medicating someone for a broken bone without setting the bone itself. In other words, just giving someone medication doesn't solve the problem. Now, I think that the medical community is already unified on that kind of theory. You simply cannot just take antidepressants and then magically you're fixed. That's why there's cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical. I forget the name of the treatment, but it's dialectical something. You'd think that I would remember that one above cognitive behavioral therapy, but I guess I didn't. She believes, and I think that this is a very important point here, problems look like a social cultural phenomenon, and the solution is not necessarily fixing a dysfunction in the person's brain, but fixing dysfunctions in the social world. Well, I think that's something we can get behind. That we are not screwed up, the system is screwed up, the world is screwed up, and as a result, those material conditions, the nurture screws up people. And then we end up suffering from these disorders. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disagree. I do believe that they are disorders. I think that we're not supposed to be this way. That even if human beings evolve to do this, doesn't really mean that we should. It's like an emergency mechanism for facing problems that frankly should not exist. Because we're not animals. Well, most of us aren't animals. I was going to make a joke about ANCAPs constantly comparing themselves to animals, and packs of wolves still fight for territory like that, but I lost the joke. But anyway, I mean, it's perfectly understandable from our dialectical viewpoint, our dialectical materialist viewpoint, that these kinds of situations, constant war, famine, worrying about whether or not you're going to have somewhere to live, worrying about if you're going to be able to afford food, worrying about being able to get by, deal with if you live in the United States, worry about being able to deal with a medical emergency. All of these things would cause anxiety and probably fear, and would activate some of these, what the study calls evolutionary coping mechanisms, so to speak. I mean, that does make perfect sense to me. So she is going on and saying that, all these things, going on saying research on depression, anxiety, and PTSD should put greater emphasis on mitigating conflict and adversity and less on manipulating brain chemistry. In other words, dealing with the material conditions that we live in, rather than screwing with the brain to be able to make it adapt to really bad conditions that shouldn't exist to begin with. And I would wholeheartedly agree. But now the question is, when any kind of medical investigation like this, anthropological investigation, medical research, etc., comes into this, you got to ask yourself something. So they're saying the conditions that we live in are causing the problem, which I would wholly agree with. But here's the thing. What are those material conditions? They're capitalism. A system based on greed, private property ownership, private accumulation of wealth, labor exploitation. All those things would cause it. I mean, I don't really have time to go into the entire theory of Marxist theory of alienation, or capitalist alienation, but suffice to say that the commodity relations between individuals replace personal relations between people, and we become to see people really as a transaction and not as another human being. That's a very superficial way of saying it. It's far more in depth than that. I'm just trying to give you a really, really brief summary. And then, because everything is a transaction, it's you transacting with the landlord. It's you transacting with the grocery store. It's you transacting with a private medical facility and the god-awful, inhuman insurance companies. Frankly, I live in Canada. I've never had to deal with medical insurance, a private medical insurance. Everything that I've pretty much ever done has ever been covered by the state in a rationally planned system like the rest of the developed world. But I would imagine dealing, because some of the horror stories that I've heard from people dealing with private insurance companies and how terrible they are, that it's just a bloody nightmare. It's a bureaucracy that drives people insane. So I just put it like that. So it's interesting. There have been things like this before, like studies like this that show this has been a problem, this works this way, and a lot of them, they point to the material conditions. And this is almost something that almost unifies medical professionals across the world. But what do you think happens when they come to the conclusion? Yeah, it's capitalism. The system shuts them down. If they say anything significant, this person here isn't saying capitalism, but they're saying the social system that we live in and eliminating the conflict and dysfunction that this society, greater emphasis on mitigating conflict and adversity. I'm sorry, but you're not going to do that without addressing the political and economic system of the world you live in. And sorry, that's capitalism. Capitalism is the problem. It is what is causing this, whether you believe it to be an evolutionary response or a mental disorder. Capitalism is the problem either way, and that's something that we have to deal with. But as soon as you say anything significant, like we have a bad system, the system causes problems like the massive anxiety and fear from just the housing crisis alone. We need a better system for providing housing. They instantly scream at you, you're a communist. Well, I mean, for you, my viewers who are communists, that's not really an insult. That's an endearing term. But you see what I mean. They'll scream oppression as soon as you try to do anything or suggest anything for just dealing with this problem that frankly, the whole world is dealing with. And I would say that in the first world countries, alienation is worse. Because it's always been my position as a third world, is that exploitation is greater in the third world, but alienation is greater in the first world. I don't think that's really a controversial thing. I think that should be fairly obvious to anyone who has a fairly sane and critical eye to the system that we live in. But we come up against all these barriers as soon as you try to change that. As soon as you start saying, look, the system is bad, we need to get rid of it, we need a new system because people are suffering, the moneyed interests, also known as the capitalists, are going to do something about it. They're going to do everything they can to shut you down. They're going to send you a Mitch McConnell to slap you in the face, or they're going to send you an AOC to dangle a carrot in front of you that just goes off into a punji pit. Probably the best way I can explain that. In other words, all these things that either beat you down for trying to change anything or give you a false hope to make you think that you can, just lead you into a trap, like vote blue no matter who. Right out of the FBI playbook. COINTELPRO, all that. You already know that. I don't have to explain that to you. You already know who I'm referring to. But it's interesting that you keep getting these PhD level people, very highly educated people in socioeconomic fields. Well, not economic, but social fields, psychology, anthropology, psychology, etc. And they're all leaning in that direction. It's the material conditions that we live in that is the problem. But as soon as you try to address that, the capitalist state mechanism comes down on you. You don't even have to throw a brick through a window. All you have to do is try to raise the minimum wage through completely lawful legislation, completely lawful protest, electing officials, and it still doesn't go anywhere. You're still stonewalled. So, I mean, sooner or later, these kinds of medical professors are going to have to start openly admitting, yes, capitalism is the problem. We are educated in this field. We are experts. We know what's going on. And this system is the problem. But a lot of them are going to fear for their careers if you do that. And that creates a whole set of other problems there. And they talk about freedom in the academic sphere in capitalism. But let's test these limits. Let's see what happens. When you start saying, yeah, the system's bad and we need to change it, let's see where that goes. But until then, I would highly suggest actually going to the link in the description, going to the actual article, which ironically appears in Forbes online magazine, which is very interesting in and of itself. But I highly recommend researching this more because it's a very interesting topic, and I think it speaks very much to the ideology that you and I generally hold, and something we should work on for the future. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.